So we've talked about the three processes as an overview of your information. So we've been through process one, and that was filtration. And so now let's go ahead and start on process number two, which is going to be this process of reabsorption. And so this is the ability of our body to take substances that have been um, filtered through the kidney, and we want to pull them back in and keep them. So we want to reabsorb these substances and move them from the tubule system and bring them back into our body. And so if you remember from the anatomy of the urinary system, we had capillary bed that surrounded the nephron. And so this was either kind of generically called the peritubular capillaries, or if it was a juxtamedullary nephron, it was specifically called the vasa recta, just because of the way that peritubular capillary kind of, went along that long nephron loop. So anyway, that's the capillary bed where these substances are going to be reabsorbed. And so what we see is this is a selective process, meaning that we have control over it, and we can reabsorb substances in two different ways. So one of them is going to be transcellular. And so if you look at that transcellular, it means through the cell. And so what's going to happen is that substance is going to travel through the apical membrane of the tubular cell. It's going to travel through the cytosol of the cell, cross the basolateral membrane on the other side. It's going to travel through the interstitial fluid that's between the tubule and the capillary, the peritubular capillary, and then it's going to move into the capillary itself. So that's one process. The second process that we see for substance reabsorption is paracellular. And so this means that basically there are, which sounds a little bit like an oxymoron, but leaky tight junctions. And so basically there's some space between cells in the renal tubule that allow substances to pass through them. And so we call that paracellular reabsorption. So let's talk about this a little bit. So this is your reminder. Here are your three processes of urine formation. So the first one is glomerular filtration. We've talked about that. And here we're on to tubular reabsorption. So just by way of reminder, we're going in this direction. We're going from tubule into that peritubular capillary to hold on to it. So this is what it looks like if we take kind of this segment here and we blow it up. This is what we're looking at. So here's our tube. Let me change pen colors. I'm a little partial to the magenta. Here is the lumen of the tubule. So we're inside the tube here. Here's our tubular cell. So this would be, one cell here. And we can see that this is going to be the apical membrane of the cell because it's the surface of the cell that's open to the lumen of the organ or the structure. Here's the cytosol of the cell. Here's the basal surface or basolateral surface. Here's the interstitial fluid between the tubule and the capillary, and then here's the capillary. So that's just kind of in general what we're seeing. So if we have transcellular reabsorption, it's going to go through the middle of the cell. If we have paracellular reabsorption, it's actually going to go in between the cells through those leaky tight junctions. So it's important to note that reabsorption happens both actively and passively. So this is just kind of a review of active and passive transport. And if that's something that you feel like you need to look into a little bit more, you could certainly read up on that. In your notes, we talked about this fall semester and also in your textbook. So active tubular reabsorption would happen through either primary or secondary active transport. Passive reabsorption happens through diffusion. Facilitated diffusion just means that it needs a little bit of a help, like a transport protein embedded in the plasma membrane, or osmosis, which would be specifically diffusion of a solvent namely water, which is what we see in this case. So what you need to know from this is I pulled out some specific substances that you need to be aware of in terms of how they're reabsorbed. And sodium is certainly one of the most important. It's the most abundant cation in the filtrate. So it is important to know how that moves. So if you look at it, it typically moves through active transport and it moves transcellularly. So if we look at that, it's going to move, we start at the basolateral membrane, okay? So it's going to move across the basolateral membrane through the sodium-potassium pump, okay? So this is going to be primary active transport. And then, so let me just, okay, so here, this is what we're looking at here. Here's our sodium-potassium pump. Here's our 3 sodiums being ejected from the tubular cell. Here's our 2 potassiums that are being brought back in as a result of our sodium-potassium pump. And so what we have at this point is we have sodium that's being ejected from the cell. It's going to travel through the interstitial fluid, and then it's actually going to enter the capillary due to osmotic pressure in the capillary itself, because the capillary is going to contain proteins in the plasma that didn't get filtered through, because the proteins don't get filtered through because of the filtration membrane. So it basically is going to pull the sodium in with it down its concentration gradient and move it into the capillary. So that's what's happening at the basolateral membrane, and so that's going to be this membrane here. What's happening at the apical membrane? It's a little bit different. It relies on the sodium-potassium pump creating a concentration gradient, and it's going to allow sodium to move across the apical membrane through secondary active transport, or in some cases, in some areas in the tubule, it's going to be facilitated diffusion down its electrochemical gradient that was created by that sodium-potassium pump. So if we look at that, that's what's happening here. Here's our apical membrane. This is a transport protein that's embedded in that plasma membrane. And because we're pumping out sodium here as a result of our sodium-potassium pump, at this point we have decreased sodium concentration inside the cell and increased sodium concentration in our filtrate. Okay, so sodium is going to enter the cell down its concentration gradient. Here's our downhill sodium entry at the apical membrane, down its concentration gradient. And here's an example of secondary active transport where sodium is able to pair with another substance and pull that second substance in with it. So we can either have, paired movement that's in the same direction. And if you recall, this is really like dusting off the cobwebs from last fall, but that's a symport system or a symporter when both of the ions are moving in the same direction, or both substances are moving in the same direction. But that's what we have here. So we're going to have sodium that's going to enter along secondary active transport at the apical membrane. Sodium is going to leave the cell at the basolateral membrane through the sodium-potassium pump. Okay. Second one that you need to know is this. Glucose, super important, and it just happens that a lot of amino acids, some other ions, and vitamins also are reabsorbed in this way. But I just want to highlight the fact that glucose especially is paired with sodium and enters the tubular cell through secondary active transport across the apical membrane. And then once it gets into the cell, it's going to cross the basolateral membrane through facilitated diffusion. And so I think, yeah, so I've got that here. So here's our glucose, right? And so here it is, and we know that this entry here at the apical membrane is paired with sodium, and that's our secondary active transport. And then once it gets into the cell, we're going to end up seeing, they don't really show it on the basolateral membrane, but what's going to happen is we're going to have another transport protein here because facilitated diffusion does require a transport protein. And what we're going to see is glucose traveling, using that transport protein to facilitate its diffusion from an area of high glucose content in the cell as a result of this, and it's going to diffuse into the interstitial fluid and then into the bloodstream from there. So that's the way that glucose runs, or glucose is reabsorbed. And then our third one is water, and water is super important. We reabsorb a lot of water because our body wants to hold on to as much water as possible. So water is going to move through these specific transport proteins called aquaporins. And those are specific for water. They allow water to move across the apical and basolateral membranes. And what we see in the tubule is that some parts of the tubule have a lot of aquaporins, and so they are responsible for water reabsorption all the time, and we call that obligatory water reabsorption. They have to absorb that water. They have aquaporins that are there all the time. So for instance, like the proximal convoluted tubule has a lot of aquaporins in that part of the tubule, so it's responsible for a lot of water reabsorption. There are other parts of the tubule, for instance, the collecting duct part of the renal tubule, that only has aquaporins present in the presence of hormones. So if we have ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, present, then we have aquaporins that will be activated so that our body can reabsorb even more water. So that only happens kind of under special circumstances. So this is what we have here. This is showing you water reabsorption. So here is our aquaporin. Here is another aquaporin, again, specific transmembrane protein for carrying water. Water is going to diffuse across the aquaporin from the tubule into the cell, and then eventually end up back into the bloodstream. Okay, so what we end up having is reabsorption of other solutes too. So there's lots of potassium and chloride and hydrogen ions and all of that. So generally what's going to happen with them is that as water leaves the tubule, what's happening is it's further concentrating the solutes in the tubule itself. So we're going to have increased solute concentration in the tubule, and then solutes then are going to diffuse, and they can do this either transcellularly or paracellularly down their concentration gradient. So the fact that we have water that's moving from the tubule eventually into the capillary bed creates this concentration gradient of the solutes, and the solutes are able to use that so that they can move. Okay, so there is kind of a maximum in terms of transportation for each solute that we see. So when we have transcellular reabsorption, we have specific carriers for each type of solute. And if you have more solute than the transporter to carry that solute, then that solute doesn't get reabsorbed. And so this is what happens when you have people with diabetes who have a lot of glucose in their renal tubule. They basically run out of transport proteins to either carry that glucose across by secondary active transport or facilitated diffusion. Both of those guys still require a transporter, And if you have way too much glucose, then you're not going to have enough transporters to reabsorb. Well, if that glucose isn't reabsorbed, what happens to it? It stays in the urine, and it actually just ends up going out in your urine. And this is why, when you do a urinalysis on patients, if they have uncontrolled diabetes, they're not doing a great job controlling it, or they ate a dozen wandering donuts before they came in for their urine test, you're going to see glucose in their urine. And this is why. Okay, so reabsorption. Most reabsorption is going to happen in the proximal convoluted tubule. So this is kind of a hotbed of reabsorption here. Most of our reabsorption is happening there because we've got cilia microvilli that increase surface area and allow for that reabsorption to happen. So basically all of our glucose, amino acids, and 65% of sodium and water, electrolytes are reabsorbed here. And what's kind of interesting too is that uric acid and urea are reabsorbed here, but later through the system, they are actually secreted back into the filtrate. So they are something that we reabsorb and then we secrete them back into the tubule. For the nephron loop is kind of interesting, and what we see here is some variation between the descending limb and the ascending limb. So what we see is, let's say here's our nephron loop, okay, and it's kind of interesting because we have aquaporins in the descending limb, so we can have water that's leaving the nephron loop in the descending limb because aquaporins are present, but there are no aquaporins in the ascending limb. So sodium chloride is going to be one of our major players here in the ascending limb. So sodium chloride is going to be reabsorbed. Other solutes as well, but sodium chloride is going to be a primary one. So solutes are going to be the opposite of water in terms of the nephron loop. So water gets reabsorbed in the descending limb. Sodium chloride and other solutes are going to be reabsorbed in the ascending limb. Okay, so that is definitely important to know. So we have other solutes there too. Okay, and then in the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct, this is where we see hormones at work. So there's going to be a couple different things that we see here. Number one, we have the effect of antidiuretic hormone. So what happens with that? Antidiuretic. We've talked about this before. If you have antidiuretic hormone, then it promotes reabsorption and it decreases urine volume because it's an antidiuretic. Okay? So if we have increased ADH, we are going to have more aquaporins that are activated in the collecting duct, and they are going to allow us to reabsorb more water back into our body, so we have decreased urine volume as a result. Okay. The second one, aldosterone. We just talked about this. Aldosterone is a hormone that's released from the adrenal cortex, and what it does is it increases our body's reabsorption of water. Okay? Reabsorption of sodium. And what do we know? What's the relationship between sodium and water? Well, water follows salt, right? So if we increase sodium, we are also going to increase our reabsorption of water. When we increase our reabsorption of water, we're going to increase our blood volume, which in turn is going to increase our blood pressure. Okay? ADH is also going to result in increasing blood pressure as a net effect of it as well. Okay? Because we decrease urine volume, and we know that that's going to lead to an increase in blood pressure. Now, atrial natriuretic peptide is exactly the opposite. If you recall, this is ANP, and we talked about this when we talked about the blood vessels and blood pressure. ANP is a hormone that's released by the heart itself, and it's actually released in response to increased blood pressure. So if your blood pressure is too high, your heart is going to release ANP, and its effect is to inhibit sodium reabsorption. So if we don't reabsorb sodium, we will secrete sodium into the tubule, or sodium will stay in the tubule, and it will actually pull water into the tubule with it. Okay? So decreasing sodium reabsorption is going to also decrease water reabsorption. If we decrease the amount of water we're reabsorbing, we thereby decrease blood volume and end up ultimately decreasing our blood pressure. Okay, so look at the trend here. These two have the net effect of increasing blood pressure, right? This one, A and P, has the net effect of decreasing blood pressure. Okay, so they're kind of in different categories. Okay, and this is what is showing you here. So most of our, reabsorption happening at the proximal convoluted tubule. That's kind of a hotbed for reabsorption. Here's our descending limb of the loop of Henle, and it has aquaporins present, and we need those to reabsorb water. Here's our ascending limb of loop of Henle. It does not have aquaporins present, so we can't reabsorb water, but we can reabsorb other solutes like sodium and potassium and chloride. And then we head into our distal convoluted tubule, which is going to be like a lot of reabsorption based on presence of hormones. So what do we have? We have aldosterone here. We didn't talk about this before, but we have parathyroid hormone that's going to work here for absorption of calcium. Here's ADH. Here's aldosterone. Here's ADH, right? So this is the hotbed. This is really where hormones are going to play a role and affect, boy, I can't, are going to affect what's able to be reabsorbed. So hormones work there. Okay, and then we have the process of secretion. So this is kind of, we're down to our third process now. We've been through glomerular filtration, we've talked about reabsorption, and now we've got secretion. And so this is our body's ability to move substances that we want to get rid of, going from the capillaries into the filtrate, because we're ultimately going to get rid of them through urine. Okay, so that's where they're going to end up. Most secretion is going to happen in the proximal convoluted tubule. So that's where a lot of this is going on. Obviously, most of our absorption is happening there too. So that's kind of the magical place along this tubule. Secreted substances, just to give you an idea, we've got hydrogen ions, excess potassium, ammonia, creatine as a metabolic waste product, acids and bases, and this is going to include bicarb as well. So any of those excess substances that we don't need. Okay, it is important to secrete unwanted substances from the body. So we're talking drugs. A lot of drugs will be secreted there. Waste products like urea and uric acid, like we talked about, any excess potassium. And then this gives our body a chance to control the pH within our body. This is how our kidneys play a role in controlling pH through secretion and reabsorption of hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. Okay, so how does our body control urine volume? So how do we control how much urine we put out and how concentrated it is? So what ends up happening is if you are overhydrated, and this is actually a lot more common than you think it is, the body is going to compensate for that. Our body does an amazing job of taking care of us despite all the stupid things that we do. So if you are overhydrated, your body is going to produce a large amount of dilute urine. It's going to be not concentrated, and it's going to be a lot of it because it's basically wanting to get rid of all that excess water. If you are dehydrated, truly dehydrated, your body will take care of that too. So your body is going to produce a small amount of very concentrated urine because in this case, we're going to want to hold on to water, right? So we're going to reabsorb water, and the urine that results is going to be highly concentrated, and it's going to be just a little bit of it, okay? Kidneys work really hard to keep the solute concentration throughout our body at 300 milliosmoles, okay? And so it does that by concentrating our urine so that we're able to maintain a concentration throughout our body at 300 milliosmoles.